What are Canadian reserves for First
Well,
Nations?
Canadian reserves are lands reserved for First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples, often with limited resources and opportunities. These reserves were established through treaties or other agreements and are managed by the First Nation or the federal government. Living conditions on reserves often lag behind the rest of Canada.
Why were they created?
They were created to isolate and contain Indigenous peoples, forcing assimilation into European Canadian culture. The government and churches sought to erase Indigenous identities, languages, and cultures, perpetuating colonialism and control.
Why did they do this to First Nation people?
To erase Indigenous identities, cultures, and languages, perpetuating colonialism and control. The government and churches sought to assimilate First Nations people into white culture, ignoring their rights and humanity. This traumatic legacy continues to impact communities today.
How does it impact our communities today?
Intergenerational trauma, cultural suppression, and systemic inequality persist. Indigenous peoples face disparities in education, housing, healthcare, and economic opportunities. Reconciliation efforts and Indigenous-led initiatives aim to revitalize cultures, address historical injustices, and promote equitable opportunities.
How does intergenerational trauma work?
Happy to explain. Intergenerational trauma passes down through generations, affecting families and communities. Unresolved trauma and pain are shared through stories, behaviors, and cultural norms, influencing beliefs, values, and coping mechanisms.
Can the trauma also be shared and passed through mother and child?
Happy to explain. Yes, trauma can be passed from mother to child through various means, including prenatal exposure to stress hormones, epigenetic changes, and postnatal interactions. This can affect the child's brain development, stress response, and emotional regulation, perpetuating the cycle of intergenerational trauma.
So is this what First Nation people experienced?
Yes, First Nations people experienced intergenerational trauma through forced assimilation, residential schools, and cultural suppression, affecting families and communities. Mother-to-child transmission of trauma occurred through prenatal stress, epigenetic changes, and disrupted parent-child relationships, perpetuating historical trauma.
Is trauma in the DNA?
Yes, trauma can alter DNA expression, affecting future generations. This is known as epigenetic inheritance, where environmental factors like trauma influence gene function without changing the DNA sequence itself. This can impact First Nations people's health, well-being, and cultural identity.